February 11, 1947, 6:15 a.m., LaGuardia Airport, New York City. Frank Sinatra walks across the tarmac toward a DC-4 aircraft. He's 31 years old, at the absolute peak of his fame. The Bobby Soxer idol. The voice. The man who made teenage girls faint just by singing into a microphone. He's wearing a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, a fedora pulled low over his eyes, and dark sunglasses even though the sun hasn't fully risen. In his right hand, a briefcase, standard leather, nothing unusual. In his left hand, a suitcase, brown leather, medium-sized, surprisingly heavy for its dimensions. The kind of weight that makes your shoulder ache after 10 minutes. The kind of weight that suggests it's not filled with clothes. Frank boards the plane. He doesn't check the suitcase, keeps it with him, holds it close, never lets it out of his sight. Destination: Havana, Cuba. Purpose: officially a vacation. A week of Cuban sun, rum, and relaxation. Reality: Frank Sinatra is about to walk into the biggest Mafia gathering since 1932. And that suitcase he's carrying? It contains $2 million in cash. A gift for the man the government had tried to bury. The man who, from exile, still controlled organized crime in America. Lucky Luciano. What Frank didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the FBI had been watching him for weeks. They knew about the suitcase. They knew about Havana. They knew about Lucky. And they were about to make sure the whole world knew, too. The trip to Havana would last 7 days. The scandal that followed would last 7 years and nearly destroy everything Frank Sinatra had built. His recording contract, gone. His film career, devastated. His reputation, shattered. All because of what he carried in that suitcase. This is the true story of Frank Sinatra's trip to Havana in February 1947. The story of the suitcase full of cash. The story of Lucky Luciano's Mafia summit. The story of how 1 week in Cuba created a shadow that Frank Sinatra could never escape. And it starts 3 months earlier in a phone call that Frank should never have answered. To understand why Frank Sinatra walked into that plane with $2 million in cash, you need to understand who Joe Fischetti was. Joe Fischetti was a Chicago mobster. Not the most famous, not the most powerful, but connected to the right people. His cousins, Charlie and Rocco Fischetti, had worked directly under Al Capone. Joe himself ran gambling operations in Florida and maintained close ties to the Chicago outfit. More importantly, Joe Fischetti knew Frank Sinatra. They'd met in the early 1940s at Mafia-connected nightclubs in New York and New Jersey, the kind of places where entertainers and mobsters naturally crossed paths. Frank, like most performers of his era, socialized with these men. It wasn't unusual, it was the business. But in November 1946, Joe Fischetti called Frank with an unusual request. According to FBI surveillance transcripts, the call went something like this. "Frank, you ever been to Havana? Never had the pleasure. Beautiful place, warm, great cigars, great music. You'd love it. I'm sure I would. Here's the thing, Frank. Some very important people are gathering there in February, friends of ours, and they'd love to meet you. Maybe you could do a little entertaining. Sing a few songs. Nothing formal. Just, a favor between friends." Now, Frank wasn't stupid. He understood what friends of ours meant in Joe Fischetti's vocabulary. It meant the Mafia, the mob, organized crime. But Frank also understood something else. In his world, you didn't say no to these men. Not if you wanted to keep working, not if you wanted your legs unbroken and your career intact. "When do we leave?" Frank asked. To understand why this trip mattered, you need to understand who was waiting for Frank in Havana. Charles Lucky Luciano was not just another mobster. He was the man who'd modernized the American Mafia. In the 1930s, Lucky had organized the Five Families of New York, created the commission that governed organized crime, and essentially invented the structure of the modern mafia. He was brilliant, ruthless, and by 1946, officially neutralized. In 1936, Lucky was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. But during World War II, Lucky made a deal with the U.S. government. He used his connections with the Italian docks to prevent sabotage and assist with the Allied invasion of Sicily. In exchange, Governor Thomas Dewey commuted his sentence in 1946. The catch: immediate deportation to Italy. Lucky was shipped out of the United States on February 9, 1946, exactly 1 year before Frank's trip to Havana. The government thought they'd solved the Lucky Luciano problem. Out of sight, out of mind. They were wrong. Lucky had simply relocated the headquarters of American organized crime from New York to Havana, Cuba. Only 90 miles from Florida, close enough to control his empire, far enough to avoid American law enforcement. And in February 1947, Lucky was calling a meeting, the first major gathering of the American Mafia since 1932. Every major crime boss in America was invited. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Santo Trafficante Jr. The entire commission. The purpose: to officially declare Lucky Luciano as capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. And Frank Sinatra, whether he fully understood it or not, was being used as cover. The FBI would later allege that Frank Sinatra carried $2 million in cash to Cuba. Frank denied this his entire life. He insisted he brought his own money, maybe $50,000 to $100,000 for gambling and expenses. But here's what we know from FBI documents. Frank boarded the plane with a suitcase he refused to check. Multiple witnesses reported the suitcase was unusually heavy. Frank was photographed in Havana with Joe Fischetti, Lucky Luciano, and other known mobsters. The Mafia summit in Havana involved massive cash tributes to Lucky from all the families. The math makes sense. If every major crime family in America was sending tribute to Lucky to acknowledge his position, someone had to carry it. Multiple someones, actually. Frank was one of many couriers, but he was the most famous, the most visible, the perfect cover. Who's going to suspect Frank Sinatra, America's heartthrob, the Bobby Soxer idol, of smuggling mob money? The government, apparently. Frank's plane landed in Havana on February 11, 1947, at 2:35 p.m. Havana in 1947 was paradise for Americans, especially Americans with questionable connections. The Cuban government, under President Ramon Grau, welcomed American money, legal or otherwise. Casinos thrived, hotels boomed, and organized crime operated openly, protected by bribes to Cuban officials. Frank checked into the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, the crown jewel of Havana's hospitality, an enormous, elegant Art Deco structure overlooking the Malecón, the same hotel where Winston Churchill had stayed, where Hollywood stars vacationed, where the wealthy and powerful gathered, and where, in February 1947, every major mafia boss in America was gathering on the same floors. According to FBI surveillance, here's who was there. From New York, Lucky Luciano, the host; Frank Costello, Luciano family acting boss; Vito Genovese, future boss; Albert Anastasia, Murder, Inc. executioner; Meyer Lansky, financial genius; Joe Bonanno, Bonanno family; Carlo Gambino, future boss; Joe Adonis, underboss. From Chicago, Tony Accardo, Chicago outfit boss; The Fischetti brothers, Joe, Charlie, Rocco. From Florida/Cuba, Santo Trafficante Jr., Tampa boss. From other cities, multiple soldiers, enforcers, and associates. Conservative estimates, at least 20 major crime figures, possibly more. And Frank Sinatra. Frank's first evening in Havana was spent at a private dinner at the Hotel Nacional. A banquet room had been reserved. Security was tight, no outsiders, no press, just the families. Frank later claimed he didn't know who these men were, that he was there to entertain, to sing a few songs, to enjoy Cuba. But photographs from that week tell a different story. In one photo, Frank sits at a table with Lucky Luciano. They're both smiling. Frank's leaning in, listening intently to whatever Lucky is saying. It's not the body language of an entertainer performing for a stranger. It's the body language of two men who know each other. In another photo, Frank stands with Joe and Rocco Fischetti on the Hotel Nacional balcony. Drinks in hand, the Havana skyline behind them. Frank looks relaxed, happy. This is a vacation among friends. The official business of the Havana summit happened over 3 days, February 12th, 13, and 14. According to later testimonies from mobsters who turned informant, here's what was discussed. Lucky Luciano was officially recognized as Capo di tutti capi. Every family boss present pledged loyalty and presented cash tribute. The amounts varied by family, but the total has been estimated between $2 million and $5 million. Frank's suitcase, if it indeed contained $2 million, was likely one of several tributes, probably from the Chicago outfit, delivered by the Fischetti brothers. The commission discussed territory divisions. Who controlled what? Disputes were settled. Plans for expanding into Las Vegas, Cuba, and other territories were laid out. Meyer Lansky presented plans for Cuban casino operations. Santo Trafficante discussed Florida. Frank Costello outlined New York operations in Lucky's absence. This was the most consequential discussion of the summit. Bugsy Siegel, the volatile, ambitious mobster who was building the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, was hemorrhaging mob money. The Flamingo was over budget, behind schedule, and Bugsy was skimming. The commission discussed whether Bugsy needed to be eliminated. According to later testimonies, Lucky made the final call. Bugsy lives, for now. Give him a chance to open the Flamingo and prove it can make money. If he fails, he dies. 4 months later, on June 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel was shot and killed in Beverly Hills. The Flamingo had flopped. The commission's patience had run out. Frank Sinatra was not present for these business discussions. He spent his days touring Havana, gambling at the casinos, and enjoying the nightlife. But he was present for the evenings. Several nights during the summit, Frank entertained the mobsters, not on a formal stage. These were private performances, a piano in a hotel suite, Frank singing standards, the bosses drinking, smoking cigars, relaxing. Frank later described these performances as informal, casual, just a favor for friends. But here's the thing, when you perform for Lucky Luciano and the commission, it's never casual. Frank was being vetted, evaluated. The Mafia was deciding whether Frank Sinatra was friend or liability. And Frank, intentionally or not, was deepening his relationship with organized crime. What Frank didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the FBI had been tipped off. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau had informants in Cuba. They knew about the summit. They knew Frank was there. And they were documenting everything. FBI agents photographed Frank with Lucky, with the Fischettis, with other known mobsters. They didn't intervene. They were building a file that would eventually destroy Frank's reputation. According to some accounts, when Frank left Havana on February 18th, he no longer had the suitcase. He'd brought it with him. he didn't take it back. Draw your own conclusions. 2 days after Frank returned to the United States, columnist Robert Ruark broke the story. Robert Ruark was a powerful journalist with the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. He had sources in Cuba, and he had details. His column, published in papers across America, was titled "Sinatra in Havana with Lucky Luciano and the Mob." Ruark didn't hold back. If Mr. Sinatra wishes to be the self-appointed leader of the younger generation, he should be more careful about the company he keeps. He was seen consorting with Lucky Luciano and an assortment of other gentlemen whose backgrounds are not exactly lily-white. The question is, what was Frank Sinatra doing in Havana last week with the biggest collection of mobsters since Appalachian? And more importantly, what was he carrying? The implication was clear. Frank hadn't just visited Cuba. He'd attended a Mafia summit and possibly served as a courier. America was scandalized. Within days, the FBI leaked photographs to friendly journalists. Photos of Frank with Lucky Luciano, photos of Frank with the Fischetti brothers, photos of Frank at the Hotel Nacional, surrounded by known mobsters. The pictures were damning. Frank's publicist, George Evans, went into crisis mode. He issued a statement. Mr. Sinatra was invited to Cuba by friends for a brief vacation. He performed a few songs at private events. He was unaware of the backgrounds of some of the individuals present. Mr. Sinatra has no association with organized crime and resents the implication. The public didn't buy it. In interviews, Frank stuck to his story. I was on vacation, I met some people, I didn't know who they were. I sang a few songs. That's it. I'm a singer, not a gangster. But when pressed about the suitcase, Frank became defensive. I brought my own money. For gambling. For expenses. That's my business. I don't know what anybody else was carrying. The evasiveness only made things worse. Lee Mortimer, a columnist for the Hearst-owned New York Mirror, led the media assault on Frank. Mortimer had never liked Sinatra. He saw him as a symbol of declining American morals, a crooner who made women swoon while real men fought in World War II. Now Mortimer had ammunition. He wrote column after column, attacking Frank's character, his patriotism, his alleged mob connections. The Havana trip was proof, Mortimer argued, that Frank Sinatra was a Mafia stooge. On April 8, 1947, Frank physically attacked Lee Mortimer outside Ciro's nightclub in Los Angeles. Punched him. The assault made headlines. Frank was arrested. The Havana scandal had made Frank paranoid, angry, and reckless. The immediate fallout from Havana was brutal. Several radio sponsors dropped Frank from programs. MGM, Frank's studio, became nervous about his image. His next few films underperformed. Frank's relationship with the press, already strained, became openly hostile. For the first time, Frank's wholesome family man image was permanently damaged, and this was just 1947. The worst was yet to come. Between 1947 and 1953, Frank's career entered freefall. Historians point to multiple causes. His affair with Ava Gardner destroyed his marriage and alienated fans. Changing musical tastes, big band giving way to rock and roll. His difficult temperament alienated Hollywood. But the Havana scandal was the first crack. It planted a seed in the public's mind. Frank Sinatra has mob connections. That seed would grow for the rest of his life. On February 22, 1947, 4 days after Frank left Cuba, Cuban police, under pressure from the United States government, raided Lucky Luciano's suite at the Hotel Nacional. Lucky was arrested and deported back to Italy within 48 hours. The U.S. government had accomplished its goal. Lucky was out of the hemisphere, but the damage was done. The summit had happened, alliances were formed, business was conducted, and Frank Sinatra's name was now permanently linked to organized crime. For the remaining 51 years of his life, Frank Sinatra denied he'd done anything wrong in Havana. In a 1963 Playboy interview, "I was used. They invited me to perform, and I performed. I didn't know they were all mobsters. How the hell was I supposed to know?" In his daughter Tina's 2000 memoir, Dad always insisted he was just entertaining. He said, "I'm a singer. They paid me to sing. That's all it was." But privately, according to close friends, Frank admitted the truth was more complicated. He'd known exactly who these men were. He'd gone anyway. And yes, he'd carried something for them. Whether it was $2 million or $50,000, we'll never know for sure. But he'd crossed a line in Havana that he could never uncross. The FBI's surveillance of Frank Sinatra began in earnest after Havana. Over the next 50 years, the Bureau would compile a 1,300-page file on Frank. Wiretaps, surveillance photos, informant reports. Havana was page 1. Every subsequent allegation of mob connections, and there were many, referenced Havana as the origin story. J. Edgar Hoover personally disliked Frank and used the Havana photos to justify decades of surveillance. Here's the ultimate irony. Frank Sinatra's connection to the Mafia, real or exaggerated, became part of his mystique. In the 1950s and 1960s, when Frank was at his peak with the Rat Pack, the mob connections weren't a liability. They were part of his dangerous, rebellious appeal. Audiences loved that Frank was a little bit dangerous, a little bit connected, a little bit untouchable. The same scandal that nearly destroyed him in 1947 helped create the legend of Frank Sinatra in 1960. We'll never know for certain what was in that suitcase. $2 million, maybe. $50,000, possibly. Just clothes? Unlikely. But what we do know is this. Frank Sinatra flew to Cuba in February 1947. He met with Lucky Luciano and the Commission. He was photographed with mobsters. The FBI documented everything, and his reputation never fully recovered. For 7 years, from 1947 to 1953, Frank struggled professionally. The Havana scandal was part of that struggle, but Frank being Frank, he clawed his way back. From Here to Eternity. The Capitol Records albums, the Rat Pack, the Legend. But he never forgot Havana, and he never forgave the press for destroying him over one trip, one suitcase, 1 week in paradise that became a lifetime of suspicion. In the end, Frank Sinatra carried that suitcase for the rest of his life. Not literally, but metaphorically. It was the weight of choices made, of friendships that crossed lines, of a world where entertainers and mobsters drank at the same bars and called each other friend. Frank Sinatra flew to Havana in 1947. What he carried in that suitcase almost ended his career. What he carried out of Havana, the reputation, the suspicion, the shadow, followed him to his grave.